Welcome back to the Commodities Institute podcast. I'm Emily Costa, and it's Wednesday, December 8th, 2025. Thank you for joining me for another deep dive into the forces shaping global markets. As always, I'll take you across energy, agriculture, metals, carbon and power, and dry freight, but not quite in the order you might expect, because the storylines today are deeply interconnected and deserve to be woven together. I want to begin with one of the most consequential developments in oil politics that we've seen in years. Behind the scenes, the European Union and the Group of Seven are actively weighing a shift away from the price cap mechanism on Russian crude and toward a full maritime services ban. If adopted, this would mark the closest the West has ever come to shutting Russia out of the global seaborne oil logistics chain altogether, not just from their own imports, but from any trade conducted using Western tankers, insurers, or service providers. Russia still moves more than 1/3 of its crude on Western-owned vessels, predominantly Greek, Cypriot, and Maltese fleets. Cutting that off would force Moscow to expand its so-called dark fleet, which is already large, aging, opaque, and increasingly under sanction. Analysts and diplomats indicate the ban could appear in the European Union's early 2026 sanctions package, provided the G7 aligns on the approach. There is pressure from both British and American officials in the technical meetings shaping the plan, although Washington's final stance will depend on the diplomatic balance the Trump administration wants to strike amid ongoing peace discussions. This shift would essentially erase the logic of the existing price cap, an approach that allowed third-country buyers to use Western tankers as long as they paid below a set threshold. Once Russia began rerouting to Asia using its own vessels, and once that fleet ballooned, even US officials who initially supported the cap began to confront its limits. In October, nearly half of Russia's exports moved on sanctioned vessels, and another significant share moved on non-sanctioned ships outside Western visibility. A services ban would attempt to choke off that flexibility. Now let's zoom out of geopolitics and examine the demand-side pull. And we find China sitting once again at the heart of the story. Chinese crude oil imports surged in November, climbing almost 5% year-on-year and reaching their highest daily average in more than 2 years. Despite a seasonal dip in domestic fuel demand and lower refinery operating rates, Chinese buyers have capitalized on discounted barrels from sanctioned suppliers such as Iran and Russia. Refining margins have improved enough that many plants are applying early for additional import quotas ahead of next year's allocation. Saudi arrivals rose sharply, Iranian flows climbed to their highest since summer, while Russian arrivals actually dipped, partly because state-owned refineries slowed purchases and independent refiners had tight quotas. This pattern underscores a dynamic that has defined much of 2025. China remains opportunistic, flexible, and highly responsive to pricing movements. But crude isn't the only commodity where China's influence looms large this week. Let's move to agriculture, where soybean imports are experiencing a remarkable run. November arrivals reached their highest level for that month since 2021, and the year-to-date total suggests China is on track for a record in 2025. Strong buying from Brazil and a recent thaw in US-China trade tensions have encouraged importers to rebuild stocks. State-run COFCO has stepped up purchases of US beans, reversing months of resistance during the trade standoff. Analysts now expect full-year soybean imports to exceed 110 million tons, with some estimates pushing closer to 112 million. Yet this wave of imports has created its own headaches. Domestic crushers are reporting high inventories of both soybeans and soybean meal, intensifying selling pressure. The oversupply is a direct consequence of front-loaded buying earlier in the year, when traders feared the diplomatic rift could restrict access to South American supplies. It's a reminder that in commodities, fear often purchases more than fundamentals demand. While we're on agriculture, I want to take a detour to a story that blends climate, economics, and culture, and it comes from Brazil. For years, robusta coffee was dismissed as the coarse, bitter cousin of the celebrated Arabica bean. But that reputation is changing rapidly. As climate change shrinks the suitable land for high-altitude Arabica, Brazilian farmers, especially those in Espírito Santo, are investing heavily in producing premium robusta. We're talking controlled drying, more refined sorting methods, and an increasing push towards specialty-grade certification. Coffee shops in São Paulo are now proudly serving espresso made from 100% robusta, highlighting the chocolatey, rich creamer these beans can create. And with roasters worldwide trying to reduce costs while maintaining flavor complexity, the timing couldn't be better. Specialty robusta prices have jumped sharply, and futures for robusta have risen much faster than Arabica over the past few years. Espírito Santo aims to multiply its production of specialty robusta many times over by the early 2030s, and cooperatives are expanding nurseries to meet expected demand. This is not robusta trying to imitate Arabica anymore, it's robusta stepping into its own identity. Now let's shift to metals, a sector that rarely sits still for long. China's rare earth exports surged more than 26% in November, marking the first full month after President Xi Jinping and President Trump agreed to accelerate shipments of critical minerals. For months, strict export licensing requirements created bottlenecks, snarled supply chains, and gave China significant leverage in negotiations. With new year-long general licenses beginning to filter through the system, the global market expects smoother flows in early 2026. However, not all metal stories are easing. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, new cobalt export conditions are causing considerable uncertainty just weeks after the country replaced a months-long export ban with a quota system. Exporters must now prepay a 10% royalty within 48 hours, endure layers of inspections, and secure a string of certificates before shipments can leave the country. No exports have moved since the ban was lifted because producers are still trying to decipher the rules. With cobalt prices already climbing from their February lows, supply insecurity could push volatility even higher. Moving to carbon and power, China's coal imports fell 20% year-on-year in November, though they still edged up from October. The narrowing price advantage of imported coal, along with supply challenges in Indonesia, Australia and Russia, is likely to keep inbound volumes subdued through the end of the year. Meanwhile, India is signalling a long-term but cautious trajectory for coal. Officials say the country has no immediate plans to expand coal capacity beyond 2035 and will hold steady at around 307 gigawatts. Before committing to more capacity, India wants a clearer view of how quickly clean energy can be integrated into the grid and how costly battery storage will become. Coal remains a backbone of Indian electricity, but even that backbone is now being evaluated through the lens of grid stability and energy transition economics. Before wrapping up, let's touch briefly on dry freight through the copper lens. China's copper imports declined for a second consecutive month as soaring global copper prices tempered buying interest. Benchmark London Metal Exchange prices hit record highs, and smelters in China plan to cut output next year. Copper concentrate imports did rise, but the fall in refined imports shows how sensitive China's physical demand is to price spikes. More refined metal flowed to the United States instead, as traders exploited the arbitrage between the COMEX and LME benchmarks. This arbitrage even influenced premium negotiations for Chilean copper sold into 2026, with producers setting levels that clearly target traders with US warehousing access. It's a perfect example of how logistics and pricing structures can shape global flows. That's where we'll leave the markets today. Before we go, I always want to thank you for spending part of your day with the Commodities Institute. These stories aren't just numbers, they're signals about policy shifts, climate pressures, industrial demand, and the world's evolving energy and food systems. If you found this episode valuable, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave a review.